beginning with the fact that I once heard a member of an all-girl street gang boasting about how macho their initiation ceremony was. The two things they had to do was either get beaten up or have sex with a male gang. Now, sex as a penalty, imagine that for the male gang. It's just laughable. Over evolutionary time, mating has bestowed very different costs and benefits on males and females. And that's the key to understanding all sex differences. They've arisen from different selection pressures on the two sexes. Ultimately, those differences stem from different reproductive strategies. That was the very beginning of it. Sexual reproduction involves dividing your reproductive investment into two. After you left cloning and you've got onto sexual reproduction in evolution, that's what you must do. You must divide your reproductive investment into two. You have to compete for mates and you have to care for offspring. Throughout the living world, males specialize more in caring, in competing, and females specialize more in caring. That doesn't mean that's the only things that they do. They specialize more in it. There's always that difference, some difference in the ratio. Consider, for example, the competitiveness. A quick way to think of it is, give a man 50 wives and he can have children galore. Give a woman 50 husbands, no advantage whatsoever. So, disadvantage. So, natural selection has strongly favoured men who competed really strenuously for mates. And all men today are descended from victorious competitors. Thus, compared to women, men have always had far more to win, far more to lose, which makes them vastly more competitive. For example, risk-taking, single-minded, status-seeking, hierarchical, ambitious, opportunistic, entrepreneurial, and so on. More so in men than in women. Now, when natural selection shapes psychology, it also shapes bodies to match. So, looking at physical competition, the strength that's most crucial for physical competition, upper body strength, is 75% greater in males than in females. That really tells you something. And comparing male and female, matching the psychology and the bodies, stronger men are quickest to anger and feel most entitled to whatever they want. By contrast, anger and entitlement among females matches not strength, but, you've probably guessed, attractiveness. That's eloquent evidence of a different evolutionary past, precisely as predicted by Darwinian theory. Okay, but what about the claims about socialization? Boys, toys, guns, girls, pink frocks. No. Natural selection doesn't build us to be putty in others' hands. Anyone who could be so readily manipulated about how to be a male or how to be a female successfully would never have become our ancestor. So, sex differences in mentality have been in the making for 800 million years. If they don't show up in neuroscience, it's the neuroscience that needs to get real.
But let's just try then to drag this biology back into the real world, out of the Petri dish and the bleeping psychology screens, into the world of the boardroom salary. What is the role of neuronal pruning and testosterone and GSRY in the existence of the boardrooms in the glass ceiling for women in executive roles? I mean, how does biology play into that? Can we synthesize these two views?
So I think the biological research, we can learn quite a lot from animal research, particularly where you can manipulate the gene, you can manipulate the exposure to the hormone prenatally and see the effect it's having on brain structure and brain function. But now you're jumping all the way to human behavior.
No, sorry, I'm asking whether biology, with its myriad pieces of tremendously useful wisdom, can helpfully inform an understanding of practical social issues, for example, to do with the sexism in female salaries, VAT on tampons, it's everywhere, you know? I mean, how can biology take that further forward, I suppose?
So my view is that if we want a society that is equal for the two sexes, that's more of a political issue. and we can change our
So
political
biology
system.
is not going to inform politics anytime soon.
Well, I mean, they're separate enterprises. That when we want to study the biology
And never
of
the twain
sexes,
shall meet.
they need to meet. This is why we're having these debates. But I think that first of all, it's very important to say that the research into sex differences really only tells you about group averages. And Gina made this point right at the beginning. It doesn't tell you anything about individuals. So at the boardroom or at the interview for the job, if you have a male or a female, you can't predict or presume anything about that individual based on their gender. And to do so would be stereotyping and discriminating.
So biology has very little to do with the real world, is what you're saying.
No, because campaigns,
Yeah.
Please, Helena, let's hear it from
campaigns
yourself.
to get more women on board, the concept of the glass ceiling is all about averages. That's what it's about. Of course, the idea of when somebody comes to an interview, that's about individuals, so you shouldn't ask, are they male or female? If it's meritocracy alone that you're concerned with, you might be concerned with whether they're male or female for other reasons. For example, you might be concerned about a jury in a rape case or something of that kind. These are very delicate and very difficult questions. But certainly, if it's meritocracy that you're concerned with, then you shouldn't care whether it's a male or a female. You look at what their CV says, what their performance has been. But averages make a huge difference, and unfortunately, they are taken up wrongly in policy because people deny there are sex differences. Because they deny there are sex differences, they assume there's a glass ceiling preventing women from getting to the top, and women are prevented from getting onto boards. Those are both in general. They assume that and say it must be discrimination. No, it's not discrimination. If you look at the real research on this, and if you look at the data, it's very clear that men and women have somewhat slightly different life priorities. They're fairly slight differences, particularly compared to some species, particularly of mammals, in which the males are hugely different, both literally and figuratively, from the females. We're not terribly different in lots of ways, but these life priorities make enough difference to get more men in the boardrooms, more men to the top, and for women to take jobs that are paid differently and to do it more often part-time, to stay at a lower level, willingly. That's what they actually prefer, because their life priorities involve doing other things as well.
What relevance is
So I'll give you two examples where I think it matters. So I work in the field of autism. So it's a neurodevelopmental condition where people develop disabilities. And very interestingly, those children and adults who struggle to socialize and communicate, the majority of them are male. And one of the reasons that took me into the field of sex differences and gender differences was to try to understand why certain clinics see far more boys than girls. Autism is one good example. A second example is language disabilities. Children who are late to talk. Someone mentioned prisons. So again, important areas of our society where we see very significant differences in the sex ratio of who ends up in those clinics or in those prisons. And the other example I was going to give was, it's already been mentioned, about universities. What do you study at university? And when you look at the applications into subjects like mathematics, engineering, computer science, physics, you see far more males applying for those subjects and being given offers to study those subjects than females. If you look at sciences like medicine, psychology, veterinary science, you see the opposite profile, far more female applicants and more offers going to females. So to me, this is telling us that there are some interesting differences when you look at big data, large data sets across, for example, UK universities or US universities, that the two sexes are equal in terms of scientific aptitude, but they're choosing to study very different sorts of things. That males are more likely, and these are just averages, more likely to apply to study sciences that are to do with inanimate objects or systems, and females are more likely to study sciences related to people or to animals, animate sciences. So this may well reflect I think what Helena called the values, different values that we have been shaped by.
Life priorities.
Life
Yes.
priorities that we've been shaped by for millions of years.
But let me just talk about this point about similarities and differences. it's pointless to ask, are men and women more alike or more different from one another? There's an infinite number of ways in which any two things can be alike or different from one another. The only sensible way to ask it, and this is not what Hyde, that paper you mentioned, does, it's not what anybody does when they're trying to show that there aren't many sex differences. The only sensible way to ask it is, where, given our evolutionary understanding, which is what created male and female and created those differences, where would you expect to find differences? And that's the only sensible way to ask it. So you would expect to find differences in competitiveness. You would expect to find differences in interest in people in living things. And when you look at those, you find they're alike. You don't expect to find differences in number of arms and legs or heads. And it's pointless to make the list of things in which we're alike. So that's just a very simple methodological point, and that is the only way to look at it, a sensible way to get an answer, how alike or different are we. And then you can start comparing, as you said, the dimorphism with our ancestors and with other living apes and so on.
So
May I make another
please
point?
do.
Jean is very keen that we shouldn't talk about sex differences out in the open because people get it all wrong and start exaggerating and so on. People use the biology, if we say there are male-female differences, they use the biology for sexist purposes. Yes, if they do, criticize the sexism, not the science. You need the science in order to understand how males and females are living together in the modern world, what our real differences are, how to help females remedially with maths, for example, because we aren't, on average, innately as good at it as males. So all of these things are very, very important to do. It's really absolutely crucial to distinguish between what is and the policy we need, what Simon was saying. It's absolutely crucial. But it's also crucial not to assume that you can just, not really bother about the science, because it makes a huge difference to good or bad policies.